Hi, and thank you for joining the Future City podcast. I'm Louka Parry, and I'm joined by my co-host Eyal Halamish. And today, it's our delight to be speaking with Jacksón Smith. Jacksón is a storyteller, learner, and tech architect, and he's the co-founder and CTO of the Learning Economy Foundation, a US-based not-for-profit organization with a global mission to accelerate the world toward 22nd century ready education and workplace infrastructures. It's fantastic to have you with us, Jacksón.
Terrific to be here. Thanks for dialing me in. Yeah,
it's always a pleasure, mate. It's always a pleasure. Take us through, well, first question, what's your favorite city?
Yeah, it's actually a remarkably easy question for me. My favorite city is Missoula, Montana, here in the States. It's the city I grew up in, and it's a city that has never left nor never will leave me.
It leaves, yeah. Its mark, I'm sure, continues to resonate throughout, and it's kind of interesting the relationships we have with the places we grew up, and the way they've helped shape us and our worldviews, also. And so take us now into what's the big idea that you're focusing from, a city in Montana now to some of the really global work that you're exploring.
Yeah, it's been a long journey. But really the big idea, at least I think it's big, is working, day in, day out right now to understand how we can create local and global economies where you can actually get paid to learn, where you actually have entire ecosystems that create a shared value around learning. And that shared value is the central engine of the entire economy.
Mate, this is going to be a great conversation. Take us into, because of course, when we think of learning, often we think of like a pay for service. So we would, sign on to a university degree or, do some sort of micro credential, and we're paying for that. So explain to us how on earth would we even flip this in terms of, being paid for learning, and how do we think about how this intersects with, with skills gaps or, the way that cities and governments, human capital investors can think differently about, leveraging the incredible power that learning offers.
Yeah, and it's exactly that, which is inverting that traditional idea that when you go to a university, to take an example, especially here in the States, you are essentially paying for a bundle of knowledge and for that, golden degree at the end of it. And so, where this journey started with us about 5 years ago really was around how do you invert that really back to a lot of central ideas around learning being a public good, right? Where learning really is about a holistic understanding of your place in the world as you are constantly becoming. And as a public good, it's something that the more all of us are doing, the more we're all learning, the more we can all face all of these shared, kind of crises and global events more, important than ever together. And the moment we stop learning, the moment we no longer value it or value it only, for the, kind of liminal short-term goals that we're going after, the less our cities are going to be resilient in the future, the less as a globe we're going to be able to face these, border crossing, border changing events that are happening to us right now.
Yeah, look, that's really interesting. We've had the metaphor, of the kind of staircase of learning, and so you do your formal K to 12, you start as a young child, and then you get to university, and then you're done with learning, and it's just about work. But of course, as we know, in the kind of the emerging future of work, including in our cities, this idea of learning for life in lifelong, life-wide, life-deep ways, I think is just so interesting. And I'd love you to take us through, how that paradigm is changing or has changed, continues to change, and then B, what's an example from some of your work around how you build kind of like a local ecosystem around these ideas. I think of the C Lab, for example, in particular in Colorado, that you've been working on as one example you might want to talk to.
Yeah, and so I'll start with I think a concrete example of how these things are, they're happening right now. And then I'll work backwards, because I think to really kind of wrap your mind around it, there is a broader frame here. So we've got kind of ecosystems we're incubating with a number of lovely partners all over the world. Looking at, as you mentioned, we call them collabs. So in Colorado, we have a collab across the state, working with all sorts of institutions like the Colorado Department of Higher Education. We're working in Broward County, Florida, for example, and then across Asia Pacific as well. And each of these ecosystems, and there are others as well, but these are three really, I think, good examples of some really interesting work happening right now, are all solving various different problems that and issues and challenges that happen when you try to invert that bundle of knowledge paradigm. And so in Colorado, in all of them actually, foundational piece of this is equity and access to systems. And so a lot of the research and pilots there are around, if internet, especially right now, is a major barrier, how can you expand access to modes of learning, whether it's through your library or it's through setting up kind of, small local 5G networks, et cetera. And then the next piece that we've spent an enormous amount of time on is this idea of a learner wallet. And it sounds kind of simple, this place for you to store your learner credentials, but it really has been making waves lately, which is essentially that you as a learner see yourself as a learner for your entire lifetime. And instead of having every institution, a library or your school, your high school, then your college, and then, what have you, store all your credentials for you and then possibly charge you a fee to go verify them later, is that you can actually essentially own or co-own every credential and have it stored on your phone. And so as you go from middle school to, you go take some classes at your local library, and then you go take some courses on Khan Academy, and then you go to high school and you get really into algebra. All of these various things that you're learning in traditional and non-traditional contexts, that you can actually carry them with you. And they're actually owned by you, that you can actually show them and share them with anyone. You can go volunteer or apply for a job and immediately have those credentials recognized as a currency that can cross borders, whether it's between school districts or across states or between countries. And this involves an enormous amount of translation, as you can imagine, between technical understandings of what all these things mean, but also just social contexts for what learning algebra, say, in a high school in Southern Florida does versus what taking the equivalent, on Khan Academy is, or in Thailand. And so a lot of our work, I can pause here, but a lot of our work right now is around empowering the learner to essentially have all their credentials stored securely under their ownership.
This is fascinating. It kind of takes me to a bit of what we're seeing emerge, even in like the LinkedIn environments, where we're starting to track different skill sets. It's peer-based, acknowledgement of having some soft skills or sometimes even some hard skills. Now they've got entire, learning networks, and people are doing a lot more online courses, online degrees. And I'm curious, in the work that you've been doing, how do what are you noticing? Like, what's the relationship between, a learner and, for example, whether it be their, a location, like you mentioned in Colorado, we've got, the C-Lab is focused on a location. They've now got a vested interest in their learners, right? So they kind of probably want to keep their learners in a certain geography for a certain period of time, or in Broward County or in APAC. Like, what's the relationship once you start to really invest in people's education, and they then own that credential? What's this relationship that we're starting to build, and what are you starting to notice in the work that you're doing?
It's a fascinating question, and we've actually done a lot of research on this, and it's what gets me really excited. As my opening city, I love Missoula, Montana, and I'm constantly, returning to home and understanding ways I can continue to give back, and I would like to for the rest of my life. And so, kind of extending the same idea, again, if we, as we're starting to see, where you don't just go to school and then give up, or, stop learning and go, do your job in your life for the rest of your life, is that when you earn a credential, for every credential you earn at an institution, it's actually possible that you could start earning a sort of equity in that same institution, which is, kind of fancy financial speak in some ways, right? That you could actually have a stake in the success of that institution. So if you go to your high school and you learn, algebra, and then you really get into calculus, and you go, on to become a rocket scientist, or whatever, and you actually might have equity in that high school, and be incentivized to come back and actually, be a tutor, and to contribute, materials or learning materials, or, et cetera, back into the schools, and not just one school, but every community that you're a part of. So the more you learn in a community, the more you can actually, in this economy, have a vested interest in the continuing flourishing and success of that particular learning community.
It's really fascinating. I think about how, like a lot of us are traveling, we're constantly moving between different geographies. I studied in one city in the US, then another city in the US, then I was in Australia for a number of years, where I've learned a whole bunch of stuff, but somehow the education kind of comes with me, but my contribution back to those locations feels quite limited once you leave the space. When you're not in the space, it's a bit out of space, out of sight, out of mind. And it's interesting to start, and I think in some of the institutions we see, a certain targeted alumni are brought back in to invest, in a big center. We might see their name, or if you're a standout personality, they might bring you back for a graduation speech or something, right? But that's kind of the limit for a lot of this reinvestment. And I'm curious, like, what does that look like? Is it purely soft? Is it hard? And are we starting to see our institutions maybe become even more capitalist as a result of this type of system?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really great question, which is important actually to kind of, I wanted to zoom out here, right? And I think to really understand these pieces and to make sure that we don't end up creating, the factory for automatons, if you will, our dreaded, future, dystopic futures. Is really to understand, in the context of what's happening to the internet right now, because in many ways the internet's, it still has revolution on people's tongues, but it has a remarkably negative taste left in people's mouth. A lot of the claims of, empowering and democracy and, liberation and free expression and thought are obviously, the Pandora's box has been opened. And what's really interesting, though, is that there's been a missing piece to the internet, right? In that the computer came along and it taught us how to crunch, insanely large amounts of data and information. The internet came along and it let us connect that information between any, two people or computers or entities. It allowed us to communicate at the scale and speed that we are now. But it's always been missing this critical layer of value transfer. This ability to send value between any two people, without permission. And so that's what a lot of our work is focused on as well, and kind of at the heart of what we're talking about, which is that when information can saturate, but you can't convey how much certain pieces of information matter to a specific community, along with that information, you allow, a single Russian troll in the basement, to control a lot of the discourse that's happening online, for example. And this isn't going to be fixed by, a congressional Facebook court.
Sure. Yeah.
These kinds of issues. It's going to be fixed in two ways. One is at every layer involving people in that hard process and in the process, right? Of, journalists, not just being journalists, but actually being coaches in the supply chain of information consumption. Right. And everyone understanding that they're not just consumers of information, they're producers of information. And when you see this, it's the same thing when learning. You're not just consumers of learning content, but producers of learning content. Yeah. And everyone is in this interconnected mesh of value. And if you can, and so it comes back to what's happening to the internet, is value infrastructures are being laid out so that any community can understand what their shared value system is, and exit existing bad incentives and create their own and say, we care about learning. We care about reducing the global burden of disease. And if you can define what those things are, and you can mobilize people around that, you can actually create new value symbols that actually back those ways of thinking and caring about the world and mobilize mass collective action that isn't just sharing Facebook information. It's actually mobilizing value people around what they care about.
That's put so well, Jacksón. I mean, that really is the great challenge we see manifesting everywhere. And I'd love you to talk. I mean, when you talk about value exchange, one's mind goes towards a currency of some sort. And I know that you're quite close with, you know, well, certainly as a technologist, you know, with kind of blockchain technology and the idea of blockchain-based currencies. Is there implications for how we might do this? For example, a learner passport or a learner wallet being based on something that is trusted and verifiable and exchangeable in some senses as well. You know, what's the current understanding that you have, or the current kind of edge that you're exploring around the currencies that might play a role in the kind of internet of education, which is how, you know, we've heard Chris Purifoy talk about it before.
Yeah, no, so currencies are absolutely an interesting, you know, and big part of this. They're not the only part, of course. You know, within our network, so we're doing, you know, kind of workshop every other month right now with the World Bank to bring kind of countries from around the world to essentially really think concretely about what learning economies would look like in various localities. But, you know, one of the projects kind of in the network was this project called the Evoke that actually looked in Colombia at ways of actually allowing learners to go on a kind of story-driven, it was kind of a fun, I think it was sci-fi story that they built projects for their local communities. And at various checkpoints, they actually earned a currency. They actually earned a currency that could be exchanged for you know, other learning materials and scholarships and you know, further educational opportunities or food. And that's a really powerful model, right? This ability to essentially allow people to donate to, in this kind of particular example, and donate to specific educational outcomes, and actually just have that unlock for learners as they achieve them to spend in whatever ways that is most fruitful for advancing their education, right? We know all this is interconnected. So it's not just, you know, are you smart? It's, do you have enough food on the table? Do you, you know, do you have access to the resources you need? And so currencies and the ability to mobilize that value toward people who are learning is really, really interesting right now.
Yeah. Final question from me, Jacksón, out of my 500 that I have, is how to, you know, there's a vision that you're working towards, you know, both as a change agent yourself, but also kind of with the organizations and the spaces that you inhabit and contribute to. You talk about the second century of education. You know, we're still talking about 21st century skills, even though no learner in a school has been born in a other century except the 21st century. So, like, what's the vision that you really see playing out, knowing that there are multiple scenarios at play? We may not get there, but if you could and are, as a co-designer in this kind of new sense of a learning economy, of, you know, value exchange, of the idea of really elevating the amazing process that learning is and incentivizing it properly, what would that look like? If you would talk about, you know, your hometown, what would the reality be in 2050, for example, if we could nail some of these concepts and really use the power of the internet, the power of technology for good, to solve skills gaps, to solve equity challenges, you know, to make sure that everyone can live a flourishing life?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And yeah, why 22nd century instead of 21st century? And you know, in some ways, it is kind of tongue in cheek, but it's that we haven't moved on from the 21st century, and these systems that we're designing, you know, we all must be cognizant that the impact, you know, like founding cities, literally founding, you know, whole countries, you know, goes on for generations and generations. And so a really key part of this is governance from the beginning, right? Is understanding that this isn't just systems, you know, that are, you know, national standardization of, you know, what skills mean and have that trickle down, It's actually having learners and teachers and parents and, and anyone who's in this process at the table from the beginning as part of this dynamic thing that they all have a voice in. And so how does that, translate into a 2050? Well, I think, as I said before, I mean, we are, entering an era of crisis, a perpetual crisis, which various industries are supporting that, and whatnot. But this is a world, that you can imagine, where a refugee can get paid to learn new languages as they find themselves in foreign lands and have a bank account and, new knowledge and skills to thrive and flourish with their family. A world where those laid off by the tide of automation, something that is causing jobs to dwindle at exponential rates, can find new meaning in life beyond an identity that's tied to just what you produce and what you make. This is a world where learning underpins everything else. The next generation can prepare themselves for all these crises that we haven't even seen yet.
Yeah. Jackson, this idea is so big, but it's also so real. And it's really riveting to hear you speak about it. And we could speak about this for hours, just unpacking what it means to get paid to learn, to build a learning economy, and all that you've raised is just peppering so many questions in my mind. But I want to close with one final question, which is, if you could put together a take-home message in a sentence or two for our listeners, what would be that take-home message?
Yeah, I'm always wondering what I should take home every day, even though I work out of my home these days. And, really it's that laughter is serious. These are big problems, and we're faced at a time where time is melting.
Yeah,
we're kind of. I feel like I'm living in the land of Lilliputians, and where everything that was close is far and far is near, and that I'm very excited for all of us to not lose our imaginations, and to remember that the way things are not the way that they need to be. And often laughing is a way to get us there.
Jackson, sign me up is what I say. Thank you so much for joining us
Awesome.
On the Future City podcast. It's been a real delight.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. It's been very lovely chatting with you.